right, so I'm going to get rolling here. How's everybody doing? I'm Matt Sanders. I work for Librato. I work on a product called Metrics, some of you guys may have seen. And today I'm excited to talk to you about, is there a thing I can turn this down just a little bit? Wherever my AV guy just went. Do I sound good to you guys? Am I too loud? All right, awesome. We'll carry on. OK, so I'm excited to talk to you today about ActiveSupport notifications, right? And as probably most of you know, ActiveSupport is one of the libraries that makes up Rails. And one of the changes that came in Rails 3 was a lot of the stuff became more modular, right? And so we can use it inside Rails, outside Rails. ActiveSupport notifications is one of those things that came in Rails 3 and is kind of a subsection of ActiveSupport we can use in Rails and outside. So the reason I'm excited about it is I think it offers you the capability to do a lot in terms of tracking what's going on in your apps, both when you're doing development and especially in production. And a lot of the information that you probably already want to know about what's going on with your apps is being instrumented for you already, right? So Rails uses this pretty extensively internally, and a lot of that is stuff that you can tap into. So let's cut to the chase. Let's look at the basics, right? There's basically two things you need to know about how ActiveSupport notifications works. There's subscribers, and there's instrument calls. So when you set up a subscriber, essentially what you're saying is, for any message with this name, when an instrumentation with that name gets called, let me know, all right? I want to do something with that. Send me the information that's associated with that event, right? So subscribers are basically setting up that callback to receive the event and do something with it. And then instrument calls are actually triggering that the event is firing. And that method name, or the message name, which here is my instrument in both cases, is basically how they communicate with each other, right? How it's filtered, how stuff gets to the right subscribers. Now, why is this important, right? Why do we even care in the first place? Well, as I said, there's a lot of valuable data that Rails already provides for you. Also, this gives you an opportunity to kind of get away from the one-to-one traditional stuff that I know I did, where if I was interested in finding out what was wrong with a part of my application, throw a debug statement in the logs, right? Toss something in here, toss something in there. Here, you can really, since it is event-driven, you can really say, there's a bunch of things I want to do when this thing fires. There's a bunch of ways I want to track what's going on, and it's super easy to set that up, right? So this is a quote from Peter Drucker. He's sort of considered the father of modern management, and I actually think this is really true, right? What we measure, what we look at every day, that's kind of what we work on, what we get excited about, what we take to the next level. And I think as programmers, we have a tendency to work on the things that are sexy to us. And sometimes those aren't the things that are really the most important things for our application, right? A lot of times we don't have very good visibility into what's going on with our application, and even outside of that, the ways that people are using it. So I guess what gets me really excited about this is I think this is an opportunity to hone in on that stuff, get good insight into that stuff, and then kind of take your application and your user experience to the next level. Another really important point, I think, is your production environment is not the same as your development environment, right? Even if you're running on the same operating system, there's different stuff going on in the background in your machines. When you're running in production, you're probably running on multiple nodes. There's probably different stuff. You may have different versions of things. So it's really important to be able to capture that data in the production environment and use that to drive your decision making, right? And this makes that easy. So I think that's pretty important. Let's say you have a service and everything's going along pretty well with it. You're running along, you've got a response time that's under 100 milliseconds, you're super happy, right? All of us love to be here, and then all of a sudden you have some big spike. The service goes crazy, everything is 4 times slower. What happened? So when this happens, ideally the situation you want to be in is already tracking all the things you care about to be able to diagnose this problem. So you can calmly look at it, you're not shelling into a box, looking at the logs, trying to figure out what's the thing that just went crazy, right? And I think, especially within our core applications, ActiveSupport notifications offers us the ability to really get some good insight into this stuff. So I talked about this earlier. There's sort of two core methods, two core ideas, right? Subscribers and firing events with instrumentation. And the message name is really what drives the communication between the two. I'm going to talk about how instruments work, firing the events work first, because I think it's important that you understand what the payload is that the subscribers are actually going to receive. So There's one required argument. It's that message name. That's it. For something like this, we could be saying, all we care about is that the event happened. Let everybody know. But any arguments that come after that in a hash form are going to be passed along with the message as a payload. So in this case, we're capturing the email address of the person that just signed up, passing that on. All the subscribers will have access to that. So here's what the actual payload that it will receive looks like. There's the message name. There's the start and end times, which for something like this are going to be pretty close, right? Because the thing is executing super fast. Basically, it's just firing off a message. And then there's a unique message ID. This is mostly to keep track of the distinction between different messages for the dispatcher. You can pretty much ignore this for most of your use cases. And then there's this hash at the end, which is the 5th argument. That's going to be your payload, right? And that's kind of the money argument. That's where all the details about what's going on with this event are going to show up. Now, there's also a block form of this. And what's awesome about this is any code you run inside, you're going to get automatic timing on it, right? So this is basically kind of a combination of your benchmark and your logging statement. Or at least it has the opportunity to be. So your payload here, the arguments are actually the same, but now if you look at the difference between the start and end time, you're going to get that duration. You're going to get a sense of exactly how much time it's taking for that code to execute. Now, one other thing that's really nice is, let's say we make this call and an exception happens in the middle of it. Well, we're going to get an extra argument in our payload that comes through that's the name of the exception and the message of that exception. So one thing that kind of trips people up with this is, if you're working with a system where you've got a lot of extra information tied into your exceptions, right, you're not going to actually get the exception object. You're just going to get notified about what kind of exception it was. So if you're expecting to do kind of deeper introspection, you're going to need to work around that. OK, so subscribers. We already kind of talked about what the order of the arguments are. Generally, you're going to want milliseconds for all your timing. You can do that manually if you want, by just taking the duration and multiplying by 1,000, right? Or alternately, ActiveSupport Notifications also provides you with this event class. And basically what you can do with this is give it all the arguments, not worry about what order they're in, right? So I mean, from our talk last night, always preferable to call things by name than by order, right? So that's going to let you do that. Basically, you're going to get back an object, and all of the arguments that were passed along will be accessible to you from it, and duration will be automatically calculated for you. The event helper class also has a kind of neat trick, which I don't think you'll use a lot, but it's good to know that it's there. So essentially, if you have 2 events, you can use this parent of method to ask one if the other one happens entirely inside of it. So in this context, we've got one event that's happening completely inside the other, and this parent of method would actually return true. So another thing you can do is, instead of using strings, if you don't want to write 6 subscribers for something where you're fundamentally doing the same thing, you can use a regular expression, right, to match the message name. So I told you a little bit about how, there's a big, huge bucket of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? Rails already gives you all this stuff for free. It's going to be awesome. Well, let's get to the good stuff, right? So basically, this is not a complete list, by the way, but these are the primary events that I think are really important that are exposed by Rails by default. So you'll see that there's stuff in here for Action Controller for pretty much all of the things that the controller actually does in terms of dispatching requests. There's also separate instrumentation around all the fragment and page caching stuff that Action Controller does. For Action Mailer, you've got events on both delivering and receiving mail. Similar stuff in Action View for rendering. And then you actually have stuff in ActiveSupport for the lower level caching operations. So there's sort of 2 levels. You can instrument the caching stuff out of the box if you're interested. Now, Active Record really only has one thing that's important, but it's super important, right? Because basically, it runs every time any query is run. So by tapping into that and doing some conditional stuff, you can really get some interesting data out of that existing instrumentation. So one thing I want to kind of point out here is, you may have seen in my previous examples, everything is sort of namespaced with this dot notation. And that's pretty common in the monitoring world. There's some tools out there like Graphite, which will actually turn those things into folders and kind of give you visible division between them. Usually, it's always left to right. In Rails, it's always right to left. So just keep that in mind when you're looking for these, as that's kind of an area to potentially get tripped up. OK, so let's dive into one of these, right? What can we really do with this? So let's look at Action Controller's process action event. I think this is a really big one. There have been some great blog posts about this. Basically, this is going to give you the controller, the action, the format, the status code that was returned, along with timing information for the entire request, and broken out by view timing, database timing. And so just with this information, we can do a lot of really interesting stuff, right? So I don't know if you guys can see this graph very clearly, but the blue line is basically the total request time. The orange line is the time spent in the view, and the green time is time spent in the database. So just looking at this, I can say, OK, for this application, the database is not our problem, right? We're burning a lot of time in the view layer for some stuff. Maybe that's something I should look at. And interestingly enough, there's some requests where we're burning a lot of time not on either of those things, right? So what's going on? Well, the most likely thing is we may be calling out to some third-party service, and that call is a little bit slow. We're using that to construct some of our pages. Maybe there's an opportunity for caching here. Maybe we're talking to a different piece of our infrastructure that isn't accounted for automatically by this, and there's the opportunity for me to go do some instrumentation around that. Here's another thing I can do with that data. I can say, how many requests are each of the servers in my cluster actually handling, right? Ideally, if my load balancer is functioning perfectly, I want that all spread out, right? I don't want to see some kind of spike like this where one server is taking a lot of the load. So that makes me think, OK, maybe the way that things are getting distributed is something I should take a look at, right? Where is the pain point really in my deployment? So I'm not having to guess at this point. Here we're looking at slow requests. So I just define kind of an arbitrary level, right? I don't want any requests that take 200 milliseconds or more. And if so, I'm going to log those as slow. So we're looking at total requests against slow requests. And you'll notice that as the total number of requests start picking up, I start getting some of those slow requests. Is that because some of my requests are slow and they just happen to be at that time? Or is that because as my app ramps up a little bit, it starts slowing down? So that's something I could look into, right? Here we're looking at what's the slowest request over the last period by server. And this, again, kind of gives me a sense of which servers in my cluster are things that are starting to slow down. So there's stuff like this that you can do. The thing that I think is interesting is that all of these graphs are things you can do with just the information from that one subscriber, from that one instrumentation that already exists, right? So I talked a little bit about this earlier. There's an event that actually gets fired every time ActiveRecord makes any query on the database. It's SQL.ActiveRecord. A couple kind of interesting points about this. Obviously, you're going to get the duration. You're going to get that with any of these events where you have code executing inside. You're going to get the whole query. If you're using a database that has binding parameters, you're going to get those too. And then there's this name argument. And this is kind of like an interesting thing that ActiveRecord uses internally. So if you're going to use this, you kind of have to play with it and make sure you're getting the results that you expect. But for selects on models, ActiveRecord will actually assign this to the model name. So like if you did a select on a user, you're going to get user load as the name in that field. For inserts, things like that, you may get SQL in that field. Some things you may get nil in that field. An easy way to figure out what you're going to get is if you actually look at your logs, anything before the timing information is the name field. Because this is the exact event that your logs are being produced from, right? But you can do kind of interesting stuff here, because now I can look at that and I can say, OK, maybe I'm interested in what's going on with database use across my instances. Do I have something extreme going on with one of them? Is that something I should investigate? But I can also say, where are the models where I'm fetching stuff all the time? Right? This can kind of help be a driver for things that maybe me and my local testing I wouldn't pick up on. So in this case, we've got some models that are being fetched a whole lot. We realize, man, we don't even need to fetch those more than every couple minutes. We can just cache the results of that. Or maybe that's something that we can throw in and hold on to for a while. And that gives us an opportunity to really reduce the load on our database. A lot of this stuff is very low-hanging fruit, but if you don't have good visibility into it, it's hard to know that it's there. It's hard to go after the stuff that really makes a difference, right? So I get excited about this stuff. I mean, I think this is really like the opportunity to take our applications to the next level, both having visibility into what's going on performance-wise, also into our performance metrics. We were talking a little bit about the easy bake oven, right, versus the real oven, making real cookies versus crappy cookies, right? I don't even want to make an oven. I want to make a laser, right? I want to be these guys. I want to be like blowing holes and stuff. If I'm going to cook something, it's popcorn for everybody, right? So I mean, that's kind of what I think the potential is. And to be honest, a lot of this monitoring stuff was really hard, and I think it's getting super easy. So, OK, Now you know some of what's exposed. You can create your own events. What are you going to do with it, right? Well, one thing you can do with it, probably the easiest thing, is put things into your log file. So you can just reach out to the Rails logger, stick whatever you want in. You can write scripts that parse this stuff, so you can do it in a format that's very machine readable. I don't know if does anybody out there use Papertrail? It's awesome stuff, right? So, the first time you see all your logs from everywhere in one place in real time, searchable, really fantastic. So you can pipe this stuff in there, and then you can get alerts based on what's going on in your logs. So I think that's a great option, right? I know a lot of us use New Relic. It's a fantastic product. You can do custom events in New Relic too. It's easy, right? Here I'm in 3 lines. I'm tossing stuff in there. Okay? There's our product, which you can use together with StatsD, along with lots of other collectors. StatsD is something that was made by the folks over at Etsy. So it's basically a small node app. And you just toss it UDP packets. So you don't have to worry about it slowing your app down at all, because it just collects that stuff, gobbles it up, and then passes it on. You can also use something like Kiss, right? So we actually use Kiss for some stuff. And this is a little wrapper that basically makes sure that the next time we render a full page to the customer, we're going to fire off stuff using their JavaScript API to make sure that the event gets fired in their system. So the awesome thing about that, and actually, yeah, one more. So another thing you can do, and this is how the explaining your queries works in Active Record, right, is you can just toss that data into memory to use later. So basically what happens here is, I know every subscriber I've shown you up to this point has a block, but you can actually use subscribe also and just pass it an object that has a call method. So what's happening here is we're defining the explain subscriber and then passing it in as the recipient of that subscription. And essentially what this does is it says, OK, if the query was slow enough that I need to explain it at the end, I'm going to toss it in a hash. And then after all of the queries in a group have run, they all get explained at once. Because we don't want those explains in the middle of our code kind of messing with what we're actually seeing in terms of our real results, right? So you can do this. You can stash something for later and then come back to it after. Don't think of these as necessarily singular, granular things. They can interact with each other. So yeah, a bunch of other stuff. We use our chat room and Campfire, stuff like that, really extensively. The awesome thing about this is all of the subscribers I just showed you could be fired by one event in your controller, right? So it's not like pick one. It's like pick anything you're interested in and tie it up and see what you get. See if what you get is something that's really useful for you. So a couple notes about performance. By default, basically the way this works is whatever you're running in your instrumentation block is going to run, and then when it's done, all the subscribers that are associated with that are going to run in series in the same thread. Okay, so you don't want to do anything in your subscribers that's going to take a long time, because that's going to make your request actually slow. So if you're doing things like tossing stuff into memory, the log files, sending out UDP packets, you don't really need to worry about that. It's totally fine if it's synchronous. If you're doing things that are slower, like kicking off a webhook or send an email or something like that, you may want to background that. And actually, more props to the Rails team, right? The entire dispatch system is completely pluggable. So it's super easy to read. All of ActiveSupport notifications is in 3 files. It's like 200 lines of code. If you want to replace the dispatcher, you implement a class with about 7 methods, and then it will, you can take care of everything. If you want to make everything process in a different thread, if you want to be serializing stuff and pulling it out later and processing it, if you want everything backgrounded, all of that is possible, right? You can kind of dive in there and customize it to the extent that you want to. So this is something I want to cover mostly just as a function of completeness. I actually don't recommend that you use unsubscribe. And the main reason for that is that if you think about it, if the dispatcher had to figure out where to send your message every time from all the subscribers in the system, that would get kind of slow, right? So it has a trick, basically. The first time that it sees a message with a name that it hasn't seen before, notifications actually ask the dispatcher, hey, does anybody care about this? And then it just stores a true-false value in a little cache hash that it has. And if nobody cares, when it gets an event, basically it just yields the block, and that's it. So there's really basically no performance detriment at all, right? If I shout in the woods but nobody is around and nobody cares, it doesn't matter, right? So the challenge with that is, and the dispatcher internally does something kind of smart that's similar around which subscribers it should send which messages to. The challenge with that is anytime you change the subscribers in your application, that cache is going to get invalidated, right? You start over from scratch. So ideally, you want that to fire up. The first couple requests in your app are going to cache all that stuff up for you, and you're done. If you do this stuff where you're messing around with unsubscribe or with temporary subscriptions, you're going to be invalidating that for your app. OK. So we've kind of covered the basics. Hopefully, is everything pretty clear so far? Any outstanding questions? Anything super confusing? All right, cool. Yeah. I'm sorry? You mean that are related to specific users? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. OK, yeah. Come talk to me afterwards if I don't address it. All right, so does anybody want to see some of my power moves then? Yeah? Nunchuck skills, skin diving skills, right? OK, so one of the big things that I think is super valuable is just conditional instrumentation, right? This is super simple, but when you think about it to make your subscribers fast, basically the first thing you want to do in any subscriber is say, if I don't care, return, right? And do it quick. So you can take that and you can combine that with some interesting stuff. So on our team, we love rollout, right? This is a gem by James Golick. Basically what it allows you to do is flag specific features. It's backed by Redis. And what we'll do in our development is when we're getting ready to roll out a new version of something, we'll roll it out in production, but just for us. And then we'll roll it out for some people that we know are kind of willing to help us improve our features, right? And then to a few more. And then finally, we'll roll it out to everybody. So by the time something hits our regular user, we know that it's really battle tested. We know what the performance implications of it are. We know what the edge cases of it are. So you can do this kind of conditional stuff, right, in your notifications. So you can say, hey, X customer is having a problem. The debugging that would be completely unrealistic for me to do in large volume for all customers, let me flip that on in real time, right? And if it's not on, the subscriber is just going to exit. So you have a customer who's having a problem. We have an API that takes in a ton of data from people all over the place. Having the ability to turn that stuff on and off per customer at will is pretty powerful, right? One comment I'll make here, the rollout gem itself doesn't actually handle things like Redis not being there. So I suggest you wrap that check, kind of do your error handling, and don't use it just directly for stuff like this. Another thing that we use a lot, and I mentioned Campfire before, is we drive a lot of our operations stuff through our Campfire bot. And it's actually open source, right? There's Tweaky. There's also Hubot, which is node-based that GitHub put out. And the awesome thing about this is, I don't even need to shell into a machine. I don't even need to jump into a console, right? I can just say, hey, X customer has a problem, right? In this case, the Travis CI team. Does anybody use Travis? Super awesome. Yes, very awesome. If you haven't looked at it, you should look at it. If you're authoring gems and you're not using it, you should use it. It's fantastic. So if somebody comes to us and they have a problem, we have the ability to get more information about that right away in an easy way, right? This is not like rocket science sort of stuff. Maybe laser science sort of stuff, but not rocket science sort of stuff. OK, so there's a couple things you may have noticed. You may be reading my slides and you're like, oh my God, I could never type ActiveSupport notifications that many times. It's just everywhere, and I have to use it for every call, right? Well, you don't have to do that. This is Ruby, right? So we can just use the standard library, right? So in your application controller, you can just forward all instrument events, assuming you're not using this method, and then you can use it all over the place in short form if you want. You can do a similar thing in your models, right? If you use this kind of pattern a lot, toss it in a module. But there's no reason to call everything by its absolute namespace all the time. Another place where you may have noticed a ton of repetitiveness is our subscribers, right? So look at what we're doing here. Now we want our log messages to be different. So having one subscriber with a regular expression, we could do conditional stuff inside of it. That's one way we could handle it. But there's actually a sister library in ActiveSupport that's totally separate that we can use instead, and that's called log subscriber. So to use it, what we need to do first is, because it's the Rails convention, we're going to flip these around, right? We're going to do right to left namespacing. So everything is something.user. And then what we can do is just descend from the log subscriber, and every method inside of our class is actually going to get called when that message name is passed, right? So our signup method is user.signup. Our login method is user.login. And what's more, we're not going to get the raw arguments. We're actually going to get an already instantiated event helper object for us. So the important thing about this is, if you set this up and you never attach it to your namespace, nothing is going to happen, okay? So you need to set it up. You call attach to on the namespace you want it on, and you're good to go. Oh, one other thing here is that you actually have direct access to the log methods inside of log subscribers, and you don't in normal subscribers. Despite the name, you don't have to use this for just logging stuff. I mean, it's super convenient that the methods are right there, but you can use this pattern, with any group of subscribers you want to. So this is an example from the actual, if you look in Rails, pretty much all of the major components have like a big log subscriber that they're using to produce your log. So this is just a piece of the one from Action Controller. You can see when a send file .actionController event gets fired, this is what gets called, and this is exactly what's generating the log message that you see in development, right? This is not hard stuff. So one other thing that I want to talk about is we can use this stuff outside of Rails. It's super powerful in Rails, but we don't have to require ActiveSupport altogether anymore. So just like we can use ActiveSupport Concern and other pieces of Rails outside of Rails, we can use this. All we need to require is this one library. Now, there's a little caveat there. We do need to require secure random for it to work, but that's in the standard library. It's super easy, no problem, right? If you want to use log subscribers outside of Rails, you have to require those separately. It's a completely separate library. So let's look at some gems that actually already use this pattern. I think this is a productive pattern for the community in general, because otherwise what we do is we kind of end up reinventing the wheel, right? I write a gem, I want you to have insight into it, so I create some way for you to turn on debug mode or pass in a logger object, which I'm then going to log to, or something like that, But there's no way for me to say, okay, these are the events that you may really care about, and I want to give you a lot of access to them. So here's some people that are already doing it. So this is from Faraday Middleware by Wayne Netherland. And basically, this is just a piece of middleware you can toss into your Faraday stack that's going to call instrumentation on the entire request environment, right? So depending on where you use it, you're going to get different stuff depending on where it is in the stack. But one thing that's great about it is you can actually customize the event name. Because I might build something on top of Faraday, where Faraday is the dependency, and I want to name the event what I want to name it. And I have the flexibility to do that. So I think that's pretty awesome. Another gem that already uses instrumentation like this is XCon. So this is the HTTP request layer below Fog, if anybody uses that, the sort of multi-cloud library. It's below a lot of other stuff, too. And one of the things that I think is great here is that you don't even have to use ActiveSupport notifications, right? I think this is the Ruby way. You can pass it any object with a .instrument method, and you're good to go. So for me, that's a pretty big win, because if I'm trying to figure out what's going on at the lower levels of my application, I can jump in there, and in the console, I can just create a random object with an instrument method that breaks to like a debugging session for me and hand it to this thing. And then I can inspect exactly what's going on. And that kind of access is the sort of stuff that traditionally we end up sort of like monkey patching each other's libraries or overriding a method to be able to get this kind of information. So I think this is a super useful pattern for the community. I'd encourage gem authors to use it. If you're using people's gems and you see stuff like this, now you know what it is, you know how to use it. So there's a couple other things that I want to just call out as I think really interesting projects. And interesting projects both in terms of what they do, but also because they use ActiveSupport notifications under the hood in really cool ways. So if you're trying to think about what you could do with this, go check these out. All right, this is LogRage by Matthias Meyer. And basically what it does is any environment that you turn it on in, you're going to go from your giant multi-line log statements that Rails puts out by default to a single, simple, concise, human and machine parsable line. So if you have stuff coming in from a bunch of threads or a bunch of servers, you don't have the problem anymore of pieces of logs from different requests stomping on each other and not really being able to tell what's going on, right? So this is pretty cool. And basically, the way this works is it detaches a bunch of the existing log subscribers, and then he adds in some of his own. This is a cool project too, Harness, and Adam's here up in the front if you're curious to learn more about it. But basically what this does is it ties into all this stuff that I've already talked about that Rails exposes, right? It grabs all this instrumentation data, and it provides you with a cool interface to do your own custom instrumentation on top of that. And then it uses Redis as a backing store and passes that on to other services. And you can use this to send stuff to our service. The whole service interface is actually completely modular. So there's the opportunity to use this with lots of stuff. And I think it's a really awesome project. Particularly the way that he integrates with the ActiveSupport stuff is super clean. I would totally check it out, because I mean, it's amazing what you can do with just a few lines of code with this stuff. The other thing I'd really encourage you to do, if you're interested in checking this out, is just check out a copy of Rails and search for .instrument in it, right? You're going to find that there's all these instances all over the place of where stuff is already instrumented. And when you go look at that, you're going to get good examples for how to put together the data you might care about in your own use, right? So there's some pretty neat stuff that they do in here. You know, look at the log subscribers as well. But I think there's a lot of value in that. So this is sort of a final note. I think every tool is really only as good as our sort of communal understanding of it, right? So this is one of those things. I mean, I think in general, evented stuff is awesome. There's great possibility. There's also the possibility to totally confuse all your team members that look at your code with this stuff. So, you know, let's not just use our keyboards. Let's talk to each other. There's the opportunity here to establish some conventions around where this stuff is going to live, how we use it. You know, a couple things that I would propose that I think are just good measures in general are, consider putting most of your subscribers in initializers, right? You want to set all that stuff up at the beginning of your application and not touch it anyway. So pick some places where the team knows that stuff is going to live. Another thing I think you don't want to do is mix logic that has to do with serving client needs with logic that has to do with your own notification and monitoring needs. So I think it totally makes sense to use this to queue up a background job that tells the team that, you know, somebody just put their credit card in or something, so you can all get stoked about that. I think it doesn't make sense to use this to queue up the background job that sends your user their new sign-up email, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the core user-serving logic of your application. What this is about is really about having insight into that. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. I mean, I think, basically, I think this is a really awesome tool. You know, it gives you a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of stuff that's already available in Rails. If you're not using Rails, I still think it's really something worth checking out and using, you know, in your Sinatra applications, in your gems if you're writing them, that sort of stuff. And I think the last thing I'd really like to say is, you know, I think it's really worthwhile to just take some time and think about what are the things that really matter for my application or my business, right? What are our conditions for success? So it's super easy. I know in the keynote last night, talk about gem install hairball, right? So it's super easy to take advantage of the stuff that's already there and say, this is awesome. But I think part of what's really great about this is it makes it really easy to track anything you want. So think about what that is for you. You know, for your team, what really matters? What are the two things that if you could know them all the time would make a huge difference in terms of your understanding of your customers, your understanding of your success, that sort of thing. So figure out what that is and go track it. And that's it. Thanks.